SECfans.com. Week 7 is here, and you might be wondering, where's Daniel? You don't see his normal, smug, smiling face. It's because I am traveling for work, and I'm in Bangalore, India, and while I have internet and we're making this thing work for y'all, I don't have enough bandwidth to get any kind of video uploaded. So we are going to do an audio version this week of all our shows and probably next week as well, but that's okay. We're here to talk, and that's really what you come for anyway. It's not for my face. So let's get it started. LSU and Georgia. Even when the LSU lost last week, it's the game of the week. And before we get into it, I want to remind everybody yet again, you can't see me pointing, but I am pointing right now. Please click that subscribe button if you haven't already. And LSU fans, we're going to talk about your team first. Josh, we took a lot of heat last week because we picked LSU, and LSU fans thought we should have picked them a lot higher than we did. And I think we've been consistent all year in saying that we like LSU, we love their defense, we're not wild about their offense, and some of their offensive production, especially against Ole Miss, needed to be taken with a grain of salt because Ole Miss is a terrible defense, and we've also said that some of their opponents, their big top 10 wins in Miami and Auburn, may not be that great either. Doesn't mean LSU's bad, just means maybe they're getting a little bit too much love. And you mentioned this in the video last week, and we saw this a little bit in another podcast that we listened to. S&P had LSU and Florida about the same. And in our comments, in the comment section, when we responded to people telling us how crazy we are by not picking LSU by 3 touchdowns, we kind of said the same thing. We expect LSU to win, and Georgia fans, if you're listening now, we did expect LSU to win that game, just not in a blowout. And basically, did you kind of see on the field in that game what S&P Plus was saying leading into that game?
I did, and to sort of go off that, like you said, we picked LSU to win, and we both picked LSU to cover, not just win. It was a 2-point spread. But as we noted in the comments, 2 things were concerning going into this game. The one, the various statistical models that we sort of look at, usually more than anything, just to see if we're maybe on track or if we're crazy with our predictions, all suggested that we were probably higher on LSU than we even should have been. S&P had Florida with a 56% chance to win that game. So S&P actually was picking Florida. And then 2, Vegas came out with initially a 3-point spread for LSU, and then that moved over the course of the week down to a 2.5 point spread. So those things all were indicators that, when we thought, and we've been a little skittish really all year on LSU being, upper top 5 elite. We've always thought they were probably a top 15 team, but maybe not top 5. And the thing that concerned us was we didn't think the passing game was efficient or consistent enough to sustain drives consistently. That they would get some big chunk plays, but they couldn't put them together in repetition as needed to actually score points. They were very dependent on the run game, and that everything was keyed off that run game. So if you played a team that had a good enough front 7 to stop the run, which to a certain degree Auburn did, and to a certain, maybe even a lesser degree, Florida did, that you could slow them down. And in any time you're also in one of those low-scoring games, things are really volatile. Again, anytime you're less than about 24 points. So these were all concerns we had. We both thought the defense was great. We thought the linebackers were a little shaky. The linebackers got a little banged up in that game. But the linebackers through the safeties, without having all the guys are used to having, like Phillips, wasn't available for the whole game. So you have, there were enough things that Florida could move the ball to score and not dominate, but enough to leave a window for LSU to be able to lose.
You mentioned that we were a little iffy on LSU, both sides, both picking them to win and picking them to lose. We've kind of not been able to peg them all year. And I want to deviate. We don't talk a lot about the model right now, or in general, because we did do a video on it. But I'd like for you to make a little bit of a commentary about college football right now and how I think, I have a theory, and I haven't really shared this with you. I have a theory why it's causing some issues for our model, because our model picked an even bigger win for LSU. I think there is so much parity in college football in a bad way, and that you've got a couple of maybe 3 or 4 elite teams this year, and you've got everybody else muddled together where any team can beat anybody on any given day, and you lack that middle tier of good, not elite teams, which LSU would normally fall into. and it's really throwing a model for a loop because, and I'll back this up with, Miami can come out and be a top 10 team to start the season, look bad against LSU, get a win here or there, and then almost lose to Florida State. UCLA is a garbage football team this year, lost by one score to Washington. So talk to me a little bit about your theory on that. If maybe we're having a hard time pegging some of these teams because of the actual parity in college football, but it's not the good kind of parity.
It's an interesting point, and I think a different way of looking at it, or the way I'd phrase it, is if you're a little bit better than average, as far as most models are going to be concerned, you're really good. And it's hard for the model to sort of peg if you're elite, if you're good, if you're great, or if you're above average, because so many teams are pushed down to average that, for example, with LSU versus just about anybody else this year, everybody's going to put up 1,000,000 points in Ole Miss. And how do you categorize an offense because they scored, 40 to 60 points on Ole Miss? Everybody's going to do it. Trying to differentiate, a good offense will do that, and an unstoppable offense will do that, and they're going to look really similar statistically because you don't have any mid-tier benchmarks, and it's hard to get those. And LSU's schedule probably has been affected by this more than anybody. You mentioned Miami. Miami goes out. They lose to LSU, then they play Savannah State, Toledo, Florida International, North Carolina, and they win all those games by multiple scores. But that, as far as our model's concerned, it makes Miami look good. But from the eye test, it doesn't really tell us anything because all this stuff's sort of built on a curve, and our model is really built on a curve to say, yeah, we expect you to do really well, and then you're going to hit a certain point where the production falls off. We didn't see that with Miami until last week against Florida State. They very easily could have lost to Florida State, and what's more important from us, it's not win-loss. S&P will tell you the same thing. We'll tell you the same thing. Your per-play statistics, how close you are in the game, those things tell you whether or not you're going to win the next game. Whether you win or lose is a big deal for momentum and a lot of other issues, and we'll probably touch on momentum because I'm not so concerned about that with LSU. But all that other stuff is really, how if you're going to win the next game, if you play, if you're playing Arkansas close and you pull out, eke out the win, it's a bad sign. And we talk about a lot. You can pull good things from playing bad teams when you blow them out. You can pull bad things out of beating a good team if it's close or an average team. The problem is that everybody is just beating bad teams for the most part. And I say bad or, very average. But like you said, Miami was somewhere in that average tier, I think. And we didn't really know where they were at in that tier until Florida State. Similarly, the other top 10 one was Auburn. And I know LSU fans got really angry with us, I think, because we didn't give them more credit for top 10 wins. A lot of that is I never really felt like Miami was a top 10 team. I never believed they were. I think Miami's probably going to be lucky to finish somewhere between 15 and 25. I did not believe that Auburn's a complete team. Auburn is looking like a 4 or 5 loss team at this point. So, from a predictive standpoint.
And to be fair for LSU fans, I was actually a lot higher on Auburn than Josh. Josh has been consistently this year not as high. I felt like Auburn lacked the running game. We said that in our preseason discussion, but I still was higher on Auburn and therefore higher on LSU's win over Auburn.
Right. So we're just predicting a future game. We're not criticizing a team, and we probably didn't say this enough. LSU completely deserved their number 5 ranking based off the resume they had, who they beat, when they beat them. It was completely deserved. We were just talking about if you can win the next game, and the ranking has nothing to do with that. There's no statistical correlation. There's no reason that has ever shown to really play into things. So from that regard, Auburn now loses to Mississippi State. Miami plays close to Florida State. We have a much better deal. Our model has a much better deal, S&P, and trying to figure out what those teams are so we can compare LSU. And before now, all we knew is you have these 10 teams in the country, and they're all better than the average teams they've played otherwise. But trying to differentiate between the 10 when all you were basically you're comparing this, like the Miami, Auburn, LSU group as a group were all kind of being benchmarked along with Washington versus entirely average teams. And where that group of 4 teams sat, which is the point I think you were making, are they closer to Alabama or are they, further down, and are they closer to Kentucky? We didn't know where that group was. We got a better idea this week, but it's just been really hard to gauge.
Yeah, and the same thing can be said, I think, for Kentucky and Florida. Florida's high coming off this win, but it was 19-20 going into that last drive before they threw the pick six, and that was at the end of the game. So LSU and Florida are very evenly matched. I just think there's a lot of evenly matched teams out there now. Flipping ahead to this game, one of the few teams that we've said consistently this year is elite is Georgia. And I think that they've maintained that, especially given the fact that the game that they only really didn't look amazing, I would say, was against Missouri. And we pegged that game. We got hell from Georgia fans, thought it was going to be closer than maybe other people did. I think you almost picked the exact score. But they're still an elite team because they are handling business. They're undefeated, and they're going into these games against subpar opponents, and they're handling business. Look at what Vanderbilt did to Notre Dame, who we also think is a playoff contender, versus what Vanderbilt did against Georgia. So in saying all of that and getting into this matchup, if we think Georgia is elite, if we think Georgia is elite and we think LSU might be in this muddle of step down tier of parity, why do I still feel like LSU is poised to give Georgia a game? Is it purely based on how they match up against them?
So I think there's two things. One, I'll toot my own horn because I get to. I had the Georgia Missouri game 41-31. The game was 43-29. I was 4 points off total from the total score and pretty clearly had the range of the scores right. 2 points off for each team. I took heat from that, I think, in large part due to the fact that Georgia had blown out teams in front of them and they've blown out teams after them. But you also are, and again, this is the same problem I was talking about before, and it's kind of why I thought that discussion was pertinent. Georgia has benefited from the fact that South Carolina, Middle Tennessee, Tennessee, Vanderbilt are all average at best or worse, I think. I have not bought into Vanderbilt. I thought it was a very bad sign that Vanderbilt Notre Dame was close. I think it had a tremendously amount to do with how bad Wimbush had gotten, and they've played it like a completely different team since they replaced him with Ian Book. I don't think I'm as high as South. I don't think I started as high as South Carolina as you did. I didn't think Georgia South Carolina was going to be close because I had no faith in South Carolina. I did not think Kentucky South Carolina was going to be close because I didn't have faith in South Carolina. It's interesting because we'll probably do a video on Texas A&M South Carolina this week. It'll be kind of interesting to talk about how that trend continues. But the problem with Georgia is twofold. One, when you look at their history, there's one game I thought that might challenge Georgia somewhat, and that was Missouri. And then I pegged the fact that Missouri's pass defense was so atrocious they wouldn't be able to keep Georgia from scoring. That's exactly what happened. So I felt like I had that, at least in the ballpark of understanding where those teams are. Two, I didn't feel like any other games were even realistically able to challenge Georgia. So I don't think I can glean much of anything from those games, really. They were when teams are that overmatched, then you end up with a lot of turnovers, special teams plays, because the team's trying to do things they're not comfortable with because they know it's the only thing that gives them a shot to win, right? Trying to take big plays, they're forcing plays. Stuff ends up like with multiple games this year, Tennessee or South Carolina or Missouri, they end up, South Carolina game starts with a pass just bouncing off a wide open running back and Dowdle, and then it gets run back for a touchdown. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and maybe this is where we transition to the model, LSU is a tough matchup for Georgia because what Georgia has relied on this year to be successful is not maybe quite what a lot of people anticipate if you look at it statistically. And LSU was built more to slow Georgia down in the areas where Georgia has been able to have a huge advantage all season in a way where Georgia's going to have to run a little bit of a different offense or push. And specifically, it's in the passing game where Georgia's been able to do, for the most part, what they wanted when they needed it in a way that they're probably not going to be able to do against LSU.
And before we get in the model, one other thing that I wonder what you think about it, because for me, one of the shocking things this year, we said Georgia would not be able to run it as well as they did last year in our preseason preview. We also said that we expected Georgia to throw it better than they did last year. I think that's played out pretty well. One of the things that we didn't really have pegged this year that has proven consistently, and Georgia fans don't at me, like this is consistently been the issue, is run defense. Run defense has not been great for Georgia this year. Is that something we haven't seen a lot of great running game from LSU, but is that something that might give LSU's offense enough breathing room to be able to throw the ball because of what we're seeing with the Georgia run game?
I think so. And the model bats back it up. And do you mind if I start getting into some model numbers here?
No, let's get into
Yeah,
it.
so Georgia is giving up 92% of opponent rush averages. And we talk about this a lot when we talk about opponent passing averages and rushing averages. Passing numbers are much harder to generate than rush numbers. This is a neutral statistic. So whatever your opponent averages, we look at that and say, okay, if they average 5 yards per carry and you allow, if your opponents all overall have averaged 5 yards per carry in the season and you've allowed only four, you're allowing 80% of their averages, trying to just directly neutrally adjust for opponent strength. You can hold teams to below the rushing average if you're a good defense pretty readily. A lot the elite defenses we see are consistently in the 60% range in opponent rush average allowed. We pretty much never see somebody get below, well, I would say maybe 75% in opponent's passing average. At times, the 2016 Alabama defense got a little lower than that, and it's probably the best I've ever seen um, in terms of just pure numbers. So, point being, 92%, you're holding teams to 92% of their average. Georgia, that sounds solid, but you have to consider you're being compared against everybody else's opponents. There's always some cupcakes thrown in there, so everybody's averages are a little inflated to start with. 92% is pretty average. I usually say about 95% is just straight average as rush defense. Georgia is maybe a tick above average, but statistically, that's it. They hold teams to under 4 yards per carry, and that's great, but their opponents only average 4.3 yards per carry. And when you factor that in and you sort of look at opponents, it's just not. I mean, it's just not great numbers. I mean, the best rush defense. Something I said in the Georgia Missouri video that I think a lot of people thought was crazy was that Missouri was running the ball pretty well and they were stopping the run fairly well. And I think that showed a lot in the Missouri game that Georgia relied more on the pass. But something I was curious about was how Georgia would do against the run in that game. Being that Missouri averaged over 5 yards per carry, right at 5.1, well, Georgia allowed 4.7 yards per carry, so just a tick below Missouri's average. They allowed about 4.8 yards per carry against Vandy. I know there's a lot more. The trick is Vandy had garbage time. Missouri really never did. So being that Missouri didn't have much garbage time, they were held just below their average again, and that's the one game I really feel like you can really maybe draw some statistics from. I think there are a number of signs that Georgia can be run on a lot more than maybe people give them credit for because they really haven't played opponents that are good enough in the run game to show it yet.
All right. So something we saw this weekend with LSU that was a little bit surprising as well, and I think has become a theme. I've maintained all year that LSU has an elite or borderline elite secondary and really good linebackers, even with the loss of Chazon. But the defensive line hasn't been great. So when you lose a player like that, I feel like it's really affected their pass rush. And I don't know if you saw the same thing against Florida, but Florida is a team that hasn't been great this year throwing the ball, hasn't been great running the ball, and was able to have enough success to keep the ball away from the LSU offense. Do you see that being maybe the key factor this weekend against Georgia with a team that hasn't really faced an elite secondary yet, but you have to back off the impact of the secondary because they won't have the pass rush?
It's probably fair. I mean, Georgia's strength this year, I think, to a large degree, is that the offensive line is still very good. The running backs are good. I think Swift is a great back. I still think, much like you see with a lot of the Stanford backs with McCaffrey and Love, those speed backs dominate when they have a speed advantage and when they have big holes. And once you start being able to clog up the line of scrimmage, power backs become more important. And I think they may miss Chubb and Michelle. And if you think it's silly to miss Chubb and Michelle, oh my gosh, if you think it's silly to lose it, be missing a guy that may end up probably is going to end up being the starting tailback for the New England Patriots, I think you're being a little unrealistic with what you've lost and how good those two guys were. But the I do think that advantage Georgia has in the offensive line and the fact that LSU's pass rush has struggled means that Georgia's going to have time to kind of do what they want to do at the pace they want to do it. And with Fromm being a good game manager, he's not going to force balls. And if you put those two things together, you don't rush him, and you got a guy that's conservative. If guys are covered up, they're just going to live to play another down, throw the ball away. I just don't see Georgia taking a lot of unnecessary risks in the passing game. And as much as it may be hard for Georgia to have, they're averaging over 10 yards per attempt, which is a really excellent number. I don't think they're going to be able to do that, but I also don't think they're going to generate a lot of easy points for LSU, in the way that some of the other teams have had a lot of turnovers and just given up a lot of negative plays. And I don't know that that's going to happen with Georgia.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and get in deep into the model, and then we'll discuss our score predictions.
Right. So again, we talked a lot about rush statistics. LSU's allowing 86% of opponent rush averages. That's a very good number, or that's a good number. It's still not an elite number, which is kind of curious to me at this point in the season. Again, both teams under 4 yards per carry allowed. The trick is they're both playing teams that are at 4.5 yards per carry, averaging or below. Not particularly good rush offenses. And some of those are probably a little bit inflated too. Like Ole Miss's average 5.8 yards per carry looks great, but they've made that average by destroying low-level teams at a really high clip. And when they've played real defenses, they can't do anything. Pass defenses are both good. LSU's, again, probably not quite as good as Georgia. 84% of the pass against the pass. Georgia's 78. The weird thing there is Georgia's opponents average less than 7 yards per attempt. They still have not. Missouri was the best passing offense that they have faced. Missouri, oddly, is not really a great passing offense. Averaging 7 yards per attempt is not a great number. Missouri is more of a run team this year than a pass team, as bizarre that is to say in terms of where they have
people
success.
are going to disagree with you. People are going to fight you on that and say Drew Lock, Missouri throws it all around the yard. They'll throw it 50 times, but that doesn't mean those 50 times are translating to points or even yards.
Right. When they had really good numbers when they played Tennessee, Martin, Wyoming, and Purdue. But the last 2 weeks against Georgia and South Carolina, both those teams held them under 6 yards per an attempt. And we talk a lot that if you're a good pass attack, you will not be held to bad numbers. Good passing teams usually are pretty consistent with their passing offense, and they will take a downtick to a certain degree, but they can't. You usually cannot shut down a good passing attack. So that is a real sign that Missouri is not one of those. We may touch on that later this week as well, in a different video. But anyway, so that's kind of where you are. LSU is more balanced run to pass. Georgia's better against the pass, at least in our view, and that's iffy because of the pass offenses they faced, but worse against the run. The difference is Georgia's offense statistically is considerably better than LSU's. And because of that, even though the defenses are more or less equal, just more balanced in LSU than Georgia, Georgia has a higher tolerance for dealing with the defense, if you will. They have start with a higher number. So Georgia's supposed to outgain LSU 6.5 yards per play to 4.7. Our model looks at past production for yardage and scoring averages. Essentially, it builds a scoring model off each team based off what you did historically against your own opponents. It does it in a neutral, automated way. I want this as a baseline. I don't want this as something that's my own input. From that model, it has Georgia 40, LSU 26. The reason for that's pretty easy to see. LSU, when they've averaged about 4.5 yards per play, which they've done between 4.5 and 5 yards per play 3 times this season. Miami, they did it, scored at 33. Auburn, they did it, scored 22. Florida, they did it, scored 19. So the model is saying you're going to be somewhere between 20 to 30 points. That's how you get 26, pretty much square in the middle of those 3 games. And then Georgia at 40 points. That one's also easy to explain, and this is the problem with Georgia right now. Georgia scored between 38 and 49 points in every game. They're in a 10-point margin because they've been able to get up, and then it's just same problem we're having with Alabama right now. Their scores are reflective of just what score margin their head coach is comfortable letting off the gas at, more than anything, to be honest. At least Georgia's played 4 quarters in some games, but they're at 40 points essentially because they've scored 40 points in every game. And as far as the model's concerned, it doesn't see any, whether they had 6 yards per play or whether they had 9, which have both happened this season, they still scored in that point range. So 6.5 yards per play, still in that yardage range of every other game they've had this season, and it expects similar production as a result.
So it's funny because the model obviously gets trained based on production on the field, but in this case, I don't know that the point spread is that far off. I do think that obviously if this, I think LSU could win this game. I don't think it's an absolute, runaway on paper, even given LSU's offensive struggles with Georgia. I still think Georgia's an elite team. I still think they're a playoff team. I think this is a tough matchup for Georgia, especially. I think there's going to be a little bit of shock there seeing a really good defense because they haven't seen one this year. But I still think Georgia wins. I just think it's a lot less on both sides in terms of points. I'm going to go Georgia 27, LSU 17. Tell me what you think.
I'm not far off from you at all. I will tell you the thing that I flag in this, and that's that the model's predicting Georgia to have 6.5 yards per play. Georgia had 5.96, so under 6 yards per play against Tennessee. They had about 6.6 yards per play against South Carolina. My eye test tells me LSU's defense, in truth, is better than South Carolina or Tennessee. And I think the model is overestimating Georgia's offense because they've had, like we talk about a lot, they've had enough of an advantage against the opponents they've played to be able to really just sort of seriously overwhelm and throttle their opponent. Um, we talk about a lot. Once you hit like 8 yards per play, you kind of get to the point of being unstoppable and think you can be a runaway train in those games. And then once you start slowing down just a little bit, your numbers fall off really quickly because you can't sustain drives. You have to change the way they run your offense, et cetera, et cetera. LSU is going to make Georgia play a little more uncomfortable football. I'm with you. I think LSU has a real chance to win this game. I thought earlier in the season I felt like LSU had a better chance to beat Georgia than they did Auburn. Now, I think that's changed because Auburn's offense was even worse than I really thought they were. I thought they've regressed since LSU. I don't think they were as bad even at LSU as they are now. They're just dysfunctional at this point. But their offense held them down. But I still felt like the Georgia was a better matchup for LSU because, and this is the key, Georgia is averaging over 10 yards per attempt and at 5.6 yards per carry. They are not the rush team they were last year. They're still good. They're better. They had less of a regression than I expected, but they were, over the course of the season, and even including the late games, they were averaging about 5.8 yards per carry, and that's about the rate they're at now. Even though they've gone through the softer part of their schedule, the trick is their passing game's good. I underrated their receivers. I thought Florida's receivers were going to be better than they are, and I still think they're good. They just don't have a quarterback. But I underestimated how good Hardman and Godwin were going to be for this team. And then Ridley and the supporting guys are probably good too. It's a very good passing attack. LSU's not going to allow that passing attack to function at a high level. They're not going to allow the third down conversions that Georgia's been able to be comfortably do. So if Georgia gets behind the sticks in the run game, which the run game is capable of doing, they'll slow down. I don't think you score 40 points like that. I think this game is probably going to be, I'm going to say 24-17 Georgia. I still think LSU can win it. We don't know what the spread is yet because this official spread hasn't come out. We haven't recorded this a little earlier than normal, but that's probably my take.
I will give you a little pushback on Georgia's yards per play, especially since you talked about Tennessee and South Carolina, and this is where I think the model might be trained right, but in the wrong way. We get some heat from fans talking about how our model doesn't do a very good job of considering garbage time. And I think if you look at Georgia's offense, even against South Carolina, they were scheming halfway through the third quarter, or maybe the start of fourth quarter because that third quarter was ridiculous, to win the game, not to score. Not necessarily to score, I should say. Same thing with Tennessee. And we saw that a little bit in Florida's numbers against Tennessee. They didn't have really good offensive numbers. They had a ton of points. So I think it's safe to say that Georgia's numbers in yards per play standpoint, from a yards per play standpoint, are a little bit skewed by the fact that, just as you said, they're blowing teams out. So I'm not shocked that it's where it's at in terms of 6.5 yards per play. I could see them getting that. I don't think they'll get 40 points off of it. So I also could see this being a game that's unlike some of the others with Georgia, where they do score points, but it's not on consistently driving the ball. It's big chunk plays. Something we saw a little bit with Ole Miss against this defense, not a lot. Something we saw a good bit with Miami at the end of the game against this LSU defense. I think in a lot of ways, Georgia's chances for scoring have a lot more to do with maybe some deep shots and might affect some numbers.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I really meant to say in the Georgia Missouri game and failed to say it. That game to me was the game where I felt like I was going to get my first picture of what Georgia was. I picked Georgia to win. Again,
I think that's
yeah,
fair.
and we talked about this offline, and I regretted not saying this more clearly. I picked Georgia to win. Georgia fans thought I was being unfair by picking them where they were. Thought a game was going to be a total blowout. Um, I thought they would win the game. I just thought that was a game where they were going to get pushed, and I thought that was a game we're going to learn a lot about who Georgia was. And what we learned from Georgia in one anecdote, and so it could be off, I could still be wrong, but that game was about what I thought it would be. And the game, again, I find it interesting that the game was a straight push against the spread we had that week, which, we don't go against the spread. Again, we usually record this before we know what the spread is, but we model it off the Sunday spread. It was 14 points. They won by 14. So they were kind of who they were expected to be. This is another one of those games to me, but even more so. LSU is a team that if Georgia has real weaknesses, if Georgia is deficient in some area that we're not aware of, or if they're going to suddenly see their offense really struggle when they play a team that can stop the run enough to make them have to throw and not just throw when they want to, this is the game where we'll see it. And if both teams are kind of what we think they are, Georgia should win by a not huge margin, I think. But I also think, it could be a game where we find out that LSU, that when their pass defense shuts down Georgia, Georgia can't move the ball, LSU wins. It could also be a game, I will say on the converse, that if Georgia has really just been toying with people to this point, I could see them completely shutting down LSU. And if they get a 3-score lead on LSU and LSU has to go throw, we saw, if you watch the end of the LSU Florida game, and this is the thing that I had cautioned all year, the moment LSU has to throw with Burrow being who he is, bad things started to happen because he's an accurate passer and he's a good decision maker. He doesn't have the velocity to hit tight windows, and he's a little too slow of a decision maker in order to find guys open. So when he was put in a position where he had to throw and they were able to put a pass rush on him, they threw a pick six, which we can get into the separate question that it was idiotic for the Florida player to score a touchdown and leave that a one possession game rather than just taking a knee on the one and ending it. But I think for both teams, my biggest point is not so much, that I think Georgia will win by a not huge margin. It's this game right here will probably tell you more about your team by far than every other game you've played before.
And we're not very good about being positive for teams, so I'm going to force you to be positive here. Tell me one thing that Georgia does really well that might give LSU fits in terms of a scheme fit, and then tell me one good thing that LSU does really well that might give Georgia fits.
I think something that Georgia does really well is they use a lot of balance, and they're a pro style offense, which means they get guys open. We talk about this a lot. Spread offenses rely on player advantages. Your guys being better than their guys, getting somebody in space, making someone miss a tackle, or having the other team make a mistake to where a guy's wide open. Usually because like teams like Auburn needs you to overplay the run, to struggle to play the run, so you bring a safety down, and then they catch you with a corner looking in on an RPO. There's no safety in the back end, and they hit you in a big play. What they don't do is straight up play a passing offense where they use a route combination that catches you in an overload in zone coverage or strains the safety so that a corner is going to be out leveraged in a route and you're going to have a guy open. That's something Georgia does. They can produce points because of that style against really good offenses in a way that spread teams don't. Their offense scales a lot better, to put it differently, against better defenses, I think, than a lot of spread teams don't. So that's something Georgia has going for them. And I think that's something that means they should be able to score points against LSU, if I'm right. Even if things aren't going, swimmingly, they're not going to shut down the way, say, Auburn did against Mississippi State. When the inside run stopped working, they couldn't move the ball. And on the flip side, I think LSU's pass defenses could give Georgia some fits. Fromm has not been really on point all season. He's been a little hot and cold, and missed some throws, and LSU will absolutely capitalize on those. And again, we've already talked about the fact that LSU is a really good rush offense, and Georgia has there are statistical signs that Georgia may not be all that strong against the run. They just haven't played a run team. If you want to call Missouri, that's the only team that can really run the ball well. And I will say one more thing positive for LSU. We talked a lot that when Les Miles' teams lost a game or two and they were out of the driver's seat for the division title, there was statistically an immediate dip. Like their statistics from that point for the rest of the season took a hit. They never played.
You could absolutely chart it.
You could absolutely chart it. The defensive numbers and the offensive numbers were not as good from that point on. It was they take about a 30% hit offensively and defensively versus whatever they were doing opponent adjusted before and after that happened. Ed Orgeron, as much as we're critical of him other ways, I think is a very good motivator. And the biggest thing he did when he came in as an interim, and he did last year, we have not seen that dip. LSU has maintained their performance in a way that they hadn't done for 7 years prior to Ed Orgeron being there. I think LSU is still going to be up for this game. I think LSU is going to be extremely motivated and play at a high level. And, that I think is a big deal, that if this was a lot of other seasons, maybe we'd be looking for a fall off. I think LSU could lose this game and still play at a high level for the rest of the season. But I absolutely think LSU is going to be, despite the fact that they lost a game that maybe a lot of people thought they'd win, I think they're going to be extremely motivated in Death Valley. This will be a very tough environment for Georgia. And that's not a small thing, that I think LSU is going to be ready to play and absolutely ready to knock heads come Saturday.
All right, last question. You mentioned playing in Death Valley. I think this is the first real test for Georgia on the road this year that matters. So given all of the things, both the tough scheme fit for Georgia and the fact that it's on the road, is it fair to say that Georgia could win this by your score, which is 7 points? Is it fair to say that Georgia could win this game by 7 points and Georgia still be an elite team and LSU still just be a good team?
I think LSU is better than a good team, even in, to my negative slant that I take in everything we do on the show. LSU is still a very good team in my view, but I absolutely think that this could be a very close game, and I think it probably will be closer than maybe some would think because of the matchups involved. The fact that LSU should be able to run the ball okay, and then they're going to give Fromm a lot of issues with the pass. And I don't know that it's necessarily reflective of the overall quality. And it's something we talk a lot about, the way our model's built to play, look at each team versus each other. It's very matchup specific and opponent adjusted specific. And when you look at one of the dangerous things in college football is you can say team A beats team B, and we talk about the transitive property not working a lot. And it's because huge part of that is because matchups are so important in football. And you can have a team that's better than another team win a game just because they have a matchup advantage where it matters. I think there's a matchup advantage here for LSU. I think Georgia is better enough than LSU that they probably win despite that fact. But however the game comes across, it's quite possible that the gap is going to be bigger than people think. Again, LSU may win this game and Georgia would still probably be the better team.
All right, y'all, that's it for this one. We're trying to keep them under 30 minutes. This one went a little bit long, but that's okay. It's a big game. We want to talk about it, and we want LSU fans to know that we still love you. And despite the loss last week, you still got a lot to play for this year, so we'll see how this one goes. Reminder to everyone, if you haven't yet already, please subscribe, and please, please, please comment in the comments section. Let us know what your score is going to be and who you think the MVP of this game will be. LSU and Georgia fans, have at it in the comments, and we'll be certain to join you there. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.